Hello everyone, you've made it to the last section. We're on section D, the environmental factors for sport and exercise performance. So we're looking at high altitude for the next couple of lessons. We're going to look at the immediate responses of the body, so that's likened to section A where we looked at things that happened in a 30-minute period of exercise. Now we're looking at immediate responses when you start to move up a mountain and get into thin air, as they say. And adaptations of the body, so those changes that happen after a number of days and weeks at altitude. So our immediate responses to high altitude first then. Our body will go into a state of hypoxia or a hypoxic state. And what this means is that the body is deprived of the normal amount of oxygen it would receive at sea level. So this occurs when the partial pressure of oxygen reduces when we get to heights of about 2,400 metres or more. Now I just want to go over this partial pressure briefly with you. And it was the amount of force one gas exerts on another. So if I just draw down here our oxygen molecules in the air, this is our partial pressure that has over carbon dioxide. When we move up to altitude, we have less and less oxygen. So the oxygen that we have available and the amount of gas that it can force on another reduces. So now we've got less oxygen in the air. You may have heard of the term into thin air, and that's what it is referring to. Now that's better. So hypoxic state is when the body has got less oxygen than it would normally have. It's deprived of its normal level of oxygen. It needs more oxygen. So what happens as immediate response is our body develops an increase in breathing rate, which can sometimes be called hyperventilation. Now this is short, shallow breaths, but the idea is that the body is desperate for more oxygen, so it increases breathing rate to try and make you get more oxygen into the blood. Increases heart rate. Now we've spoken about this a lot. There's no point in increasing a breathing rate to get increased oxygen if we don't increase the heart rate as well to transfer, to move that blood flow round to the skeletal muscle for exercise. At rest, the heart can go up to 100 beats per minute depending on the altitude that you're at. So as the higher you go, the less air there is. Now this increasing resting heart rate to over 100 beats per minute is called tachycardia. So do you remember from section C, bradycardia, which was when the resting heart rate reduced down because of the increased size of the heart muscle, the hypertrophy of the heart muscle? This is nothing to do with growth or shrinking of heart muscle. It's just to do with increased resting heart rate to try to make up for the lack of oxygen. So someone can be tachycardic. There is reduced VO2 max. This is the volume of oxygen the body can utilise. So not that it has in its lungs, but that it takes across its lung membrane and down into the muscle cell. So VO2 max, the maximum amount of oxygen you can utilise, is reduced. Altitude sickness is a big problem, especially if you're an athlete trying to train. It's not particular about who it affects. It just can affect you or it might not affect you. But it's quite debilitating. It can give you headaches and actual sickness, which means, as we'll discuss later on, it can have a severe impact on your level of training or performance. And we have a decreased oxygen carrying capacity for obvious reasons, and we have a reduced extraction of oxygen from the blood. So even though we're getting less oxygen on the hemoglobin, so less oxygen travelling across from the lung tissue into the blood and the hemoglobin, we're now not managing to get as much oxygen out of that and extract it from the blood into the muscle tissue. So now we move on to adaptation. So this is likened to section C. These are changes the body has made over a number of days or weeks. So not necessarily what we'd call long-term, certainly not 8 weeks of training like we discussed in section C, but certainly longer than an immediate response. So the adaptations are made to compensate for the lack of oxygen in the air, to compensate for the lack of oxygen. There is increased red blood cell production, which is the same actually as 8 weeks of aerobic training. So we're getting the same impact already. So we get more red blood cells, and of course if we're getting more red blood cells produced, we're going to get more hemoglobin. If we've got more hemoglobin, we can carry more oxygen. And within 4 or 5 days at being at altitude, where the partial pressure of oxygen is lower, where the actual amount of oxygen is lower, we get an increased oxygen carrying capacity. Can be up to 50% more. That's huge if you think about that in terms of performance. So what does that mean for a performer? It means if they're carrying 50% more oxygen, when they go back down to sea level, then they are going to be able to respire using the aerobic system 50% more than they did before. That could mean quicker recoveries. That could mean that they can work at a higher intensity, so they're faster, so they're breaking their race records, or they're starting to overtake people in a game of football, for example. So increased capillarization around the lungs and around the muscle tissue. So we're extracting the oxygen from the lungs and we're delivering it down to the muscle tissue. And also the other biggie is that we can take more carbon dioxide out. If we can take more carbon dioxide out, then we can reduce the impact of hydrogen in our blood, if you remember that from section C as well. Increased mitochondria. So in the muscle cell, we've got the powerhouse of the cell, we get more of those, and if we've got more of those, we've got more oxidative enzymes. Now, in the mitochondria, we have Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, which is why they're called the powerhouse of the cell. But this means we can increase aerobic respiration again. There's one final point here, which is quite interesting. But at altitude, the body starts to burn fat rather than carbohydrates. And it does this to avoid the glycolysis section of the aerobic and anaerobic respiration system. And it does that to stop lactate being produced. So if it relies heavily on fats, although it's slower, it will go straight into Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain, and therefore we don't get lactic acid. Another amazing adaptation. What that means for our sport is that we can work at higher intensities for longer periods without feeling the anaerobic threshold or without feeling obla. So really useful. Now, all of these adaptations are identical to those which you get when you train in an endurance fashion. So if you're doing interval training, if you're doing long continuous runs, you get the same results. But this obviously is 4 or 5 days at altitude. And now, excuse me, we don't even need to go abroad for this. So athletes used to go away into training camps, but now they have the means to do this in a chamber in their own gym, for example. So who does it benefit then if we do get these adaptations? Why do we bother going to altitude? It doesn't really benefit the anaerobic athletes so much, so those doing shot put or those doing 100-metre sprints, although if they have a tough training day and they're doing lots of anaerobic training, they do need to recover. They need to, in EPOC, they need to do that, convert that lactic acid back, and that all takes oxygen, excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. If you remember that, the slow and the fast replenishment. This oxygen does need to be replenished to convert all of that back, to convert their glycogen stores back. So it does help with recovery after a tough training session or tough performance. It's more beneficial to your aerobic athletes, so those like marathon runners or games players, and it allows them to work at high intensity for longer durations because we're able to use the aerobic system longer than we did before because of our oxygen carrying capacity, because of the increase in that capacity. I just want to point out again that they train at high altitude. This isn't always performing at high altitude. So there are so many disadvantages to training at high altitude. Essentially, and this is why they built these little sheds, if you like, where you can put your treadmills in. I'll show you a picture in the next slide. So, because there are too many disadvantages, and these disadvantages can reduce the amount of training that you're actually able to do, and it can reduce the quality of training. So when an athlete does go and train at altitude, they can't do the speeds that they're used to. Now, the downside to that is that if your body is used to running at a certain speed, then your tendons, your ligaments, your cartilage, your muscles are all used to working at that intensity. If you can't keep that intensity up, although you get good aerobic changes like an increase in hemoglobin, your muscles and your tendons and your cartilage are not going to be used to that intensity of exercise. So if you then return back to sea level, you could injure yourself. It means that you can't train as much, so the volume of training would have to be tapered, and the quality of training would reduce as well. So, and this is all down to poor sleep. So a lot of people can't sleep well at altitude, so you're waking up tired and probably don't feel like training and not going to put as much effort into it. I've mentioned this already, so the intensity of training has to be reduced because you physically can't get the oxygen into your body at altitude to be able to sustain the high intensities that you did down at sea level. So this has detraining effects. So sometimes it can seem like you haven't been training as much. Altitude sickness we've mentioned before, that can be in the form of headaches or actual vomiting. It has a negative impact on the immune system, so it can make you more liable to catch colds and just minor illnesses that again have a negative impact on training. It's not a long-term solution. As we get reversibility, that means it goes back to the way it was beforehand. So as soon as you're not in that environment, the body stops making the extra red blood cells and the extra hemoglobin because it no longer needs it, because you're no longer deprived of that oxygen. So after 21 days, we're completely reversed. If you have to travel, and anyone who's been skiing knows this, you're going up the mountain, it's quite a long trip up a mountain, and then when you get there you're going to do your exercises, your training sessions, and then you're going to return back down, and it can be very tiring. So again, if you're not sleeping, if you're travelling, it's going to reduce the amount of exercise you can do and the intensity of your training sessions as well, causing this detraining effect. So just to summarise here, we've got a list of the impact of training at high altitude. Tiredness reduces the quality of training, which leads to the detraining effect. Decreases muscle mass or atrophy because you're not using those muscles to the same intensity that you were at sea level. You are going to lose some of that hypertrophy that you gained from lower levels when you were training harder. Therefore, we're going to get a decrease in performance and probably a tapering of your training, which is a reduction in the volume. So we would have done this in class, but I would like you to repeat it for your homework, please, because we would have done it in class and marked it and got some feedback. So this time, try and write it even better. If you flip this learning and you're doing it in advance of the lesson, give it a go, because we're going to do it in the lesson as well, and we're going to mark it and talk through it. So just pause the video, have a read, and stick with our 3-point answer. We're going to have a look at little hypoxic chamber as well. So what's happened is people have designed these chambers so you don't have to travel to France to work at altitude, for example, or potentially even go over to Ethiopia in Africa to train at altitude. They've developed these chambers so you can train inside, and it's quite convenient. So this is just one example of what they might look like. Notice it's called elevation there. This is a hypoxic chamber where you can see people training in there, and this was to do Kilimanjaro. So we've got a treadmill, we've got a cross trainer and a rowing machine, and essentially what this does is mimics the altitude, or being at altitude, so it takes the level of oxygen down, or reduces it to whatever level you need to make the right adaptations. Now, you do have to get used to being at altitude, so that would have to be done in slow increments. So what they can do is they can train in a hypoxic chamber, if you've seen below, but they can also sleep in one. If you sleep in one, you get all the benefits of increased red blood cells, increased hemoglobin, because you're deprived of oxygen when you're sleeping. But it doesn't have the detrimental effect on your training. So you don't have to reduce the intensity of your training, and you don't have to reduce the volume of your training because you might be feeling sick, or you might, because of the lack of oxygen, you can't actually do the same intensity. So sleeping gives you some of the benefits, some of the increase in blood cells, but without any of the detrimental effects that it could have. So it stimulates being at altitude without the poor or the negative responses. So you get the adaptations without all of the negative effects. There is a reduced risk of altitude sickness, so your training is not affected. That's not saying it's not going to happen. Some people may need to be put into the hypoxic chamber more gradually than others, but it does certainly reduce the risk of altitude training because it's adaptable. You can move it and change the levels. There's no need to taper your exercise. If you're not training in there and you're just sleeping in there, you don't need to taper your exercise, so you're not going to get muscular atrophy. Your tendons and ligaments aren't going to get weaker. They will stay the same because in the daytime you're training as normal with the normal levels of oxygen, but just sleeping in the hypoxic chamber overnight. This means that we can maintain the quantity and the quality of your training. So to recap the overall benefits of this then, when you return to sea level, you will have an increase in VO2 max. That's the volume of oxygen the body can utilise. So that's absorb and move into one of our, either our anaerobic or our aerobic system. By increasing the oxygen, we're increasing our capacity for the aerobic system, which is what we want because there's no debilitating byproducts, just carbon dioxide and water. So when we return to sea level, we've got increased VO2 max, which means we can sustain a higher level of aerobic performance. Our body has all the adaptations as it would have from an 8-week period of training. But with an athlete, they can do this on top of their training, so they get excess benefits. It means that you can play at much higher intensities for much longer periods. For a marathon runner, that means they can go faster in a shorter period of time, so they can beat their personal bests. For a games player, it means that they can continue to play at a high intensity for the duration of the game, so be as effective at the end of the game as they were at the beginning of the game. It also has benefits for recovery. So EPOC, that oxygen that we need after we finished exercise to recover all of our energy systems, and if you can't remember that, you need to go back to section B and have a read of that. This is going to happen quicker because the amount of oxygen that we are absorbing and utilising after exercise is increased, like we said, up to potentially 50%. The downside is it's reversible after 21 days, but this means that you can peak for an event. So they're very useful if you use a hypoxic chamber, for example. Just to finish off, could you please make sure that you complete all the tasks on the OneNote?